Dive into the shadows. A new series of psychological horror stories to haunt your nights. Are you ready to explore the dark recesses of the human mind, where fear lurks in the shadows and reality is never quite what it seems? Welcome to a new series of psychological horror tales that will send shivers down your spine and leave you questioning what's real and what's not. Over the next few weeks, I'll be sharing a collection of short stories designed to unsettle, disturb, and linger in your thoughts long after you've finished reading. Each story in this series delves into the eerie and the uncanny, where ordinary lives are turned upside down by the inexplicable and the terrifying. From haunted reflections to silent towns, these tales explore the subtle, creeping dread that only psychological horror can evoke. If you're a fan of the slow burn, the unsettling twist, and the thrill of the unknown, then you're in for a treat, or perhaps a nightmare. Why psychological horror? Horror comes in many forms, from the visceral gore of slasher films to the jump scares of supernatural thrillers. But psychological horror is something different. It's a genre that taps into the fears we all carry with us, the fear of losing control, the fear of the unknown, and the fear that the world is not as safe and predictable as we'd like to believe. Psychological horror doesn't just scare you in the moment, it burrows into your mind, leaving you with a lingering sense of unease. It's the kind of horror that makes you check the mirror twice, wonder what's lurking in the shadows, and question your own sanity. This is the essence of the stories I'll be sharing with you, a series of unsettling tales that explore the darker side of the human psyche. The first tale, The Mirror's Reflection. To kick off this series, I'm thrilled to introduce the first story, The Mirror's Reflection. This tale explores the unsettling idea that our reflections might not just be passive copies of ourselves, but something more, something with a life of its own. The Mirror's Reflection. Sarah lived a quiet, solitary life in her small, dimly lit apartment at the edge of the city. Her days were filled with the mundane routines of work, dinner, and late-night television. She found comfort in her solitude, the stillness of her surroundings soothing her weary mind after the bustle of the day. Her apartment was a reflection of her life, simple, orderly, and devoid of surprises. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at work, Sarah prepared for bed. She washed her face, brushed her teeth, and glanced up at the mirror as she reached for her towel. Her hand froze. For a split second, her reflection seemed out of sync, moving a fraction of a second slower than she did. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and looked again. The reflection was perfectly normal, mimicking her every move with the precision she expected. Sarah chuckled nervously, chalking it up to tiredness. It was late, and her mind was likely playing tricks on her. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a gnawing unease settled in the pit of her stomach. The image of that slight delay in the mirror replayed in her mind, over and over, until sleep finally claimed her. The next day passed without incident, and by the time Sarah returned home, she had almost forgotten about the mirror. Almost. As she brushed her hair that evening, she glanced at the mirror out of habit. This time, the reflection smiled. But Sarah wasn't smiling. She dropped the brush, her heart pounding in her chest. The reflection continued to grin, a slow, unsettling smile that didn't belong on her face. She stepped back, staring in disbelief. As quickly as it had appeared, the smile vanished, and her reflection was once again an ordinary reflection. No trace of the eerie grin remained. Sarah turned away from the mirror, her hands trembling. It had to be stress, she told herself. Or maybe she was just overtired. She avoided the mirror for the rest of the night, opting to change into her pajamas without looking at her reflection. Over the next few days, Sarah began to notice more strange discrepancies in the mirror. At first, it was small things. Her reflection would blink when she hadn't, or tilt its head at an odd angle as she stared straight ahead. Then, the incidents grew more disturbing. One morning, she watched in horror as her reflection waved at her, even though she was standing completely still. Terrified, Sarah began to avoid mirrors altogether. She even started draping towels over them, desperate to block out the unsettling reflections. But the unease followed her wherever she went. Windows, puddles, the glass on her oven door, anything reflective seemed to hold an echo of that disturbing presence, a shadow of something lurking just beneath the surface. Her isolation deepened. Sarah stopped going out, stopped calling her friends, and spent her days in her apartment, avoiding any reflective surface. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not just watched, studied, by something that knew her better than she knew herself. One night, after another restless evening of tossing and turning, Sarah awoke to a strange sensation. Her bedroom was dark, but something was wrong. She could feel it. Slowly, she turned her head toward the mirror on the wall. Her heart nearly stopped. Her reflection was standing in the mirror, staring at her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She was lying in bed, but her reflection was upright, standing just inches from the glass. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at her with cold, unblinking eyes. Panic gripped her, but she couldn't look away. Then the reflection spoke. "You're not who you think you are," it whispered, the voice a distorted echo of her own. "I know things about you. Things you've forgotten." Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. She tried to close her eyes, to shut out the horrifying image, but the reflection's voice cut through her thoughts. "Don't you want to know the truth?" it asked, its tone mocking. "Don't you want to remember?" With a strangled cry, Sarah leaped out of bed and lunged for the mirror. She was going to shatter it, break it into a million pieces, and be free of this nightmare. But as she raised her fist to strike, the reflection's hand shot out from the glass and grabbed her wrist. The glass rippled like liquid under the reflection's touch. Sarah screamed, struggling to pull away, but the grip was like iron. The reflection leaned closer, its breath cold against her skin. "Let me in," it whispered, a sinister smile spreading across its face. "Let me live your life." The next morning, Sarah's friends noticed something different about her. She was quieter, more reserved, as if a shadow had settled over her. When they asked her if everything was okay, she simply smiled and said she was fine. But there was something in that smile, something unsettling, something that sent a chill down their spines. When Sarah looked in the mirror now, her reflection moved perfectly in sync. There were no more discrepancies, no more eerie smiles or strange movements. But if anyone looked closely, they might notice that the smile in the reflection seemed a little too sharp, a little too knowing. Sarah's friends tried to dismiss their unease, but the feeling lingered. They couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong, that the Sarah they knew was gone, replaced by something else, something that watched them with cold, unblinking eyes whenever they weren't looking. And somewhere, far away, behind a pane of glass, the real Sarah screamed silently, trapped in a world of shadows and reflections, forever lost to the mirror's cold embrace. What's next? The mirror's reflection is just the beginning. Over the coming weeks, I'll be sharing more stories in this series, each one delving into a different aspect of psychological horror. You'll meet characters who find themselves trapped in looping days, forgotten memories, cursed objects, and more. Each tale is designed to make you think twice about the ordinary, to see the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. If you enjoyed this story, stay tuned for the next installment. And if you're brave enough, listen to these tales late at night when the house is quiet and the shadows are long. Just remember to check your reflection before you go to bed. You never know what might be staring back at you. Subscribe, like, and share. Don't miss out on the next chilling tale. Subscribe.